The wind had teeth that night, sharp and vicious as any wolf's, and Tessa Edwards felt every bite as the wagon lurched violently to the left and sent her sprawling into the howling white darkness. One moment, she had been clutching the wooden bench with frozen fingers, her father shouting something she couldn't hear over the storm's roar, and the next, she was airborne, spinning through a world gone completely blank. She hit the ground hard, her shoulder taking the worst of it, and then she was tumbling, rolling down what must have been an embankment, snow filling her mouth and nose and eyes until she couldn't tell which way was up. When she finally stopped moving, wedged against something solid that might have been a rock or a fallen tree, the wagon was gone. The sound of its wheels, her father's voice, her mother's screams, all of it swallowed by the blizzard as if they had never existed at all. Tessa tried to stand, but her left leg buckled beneath her, sending fresh waves of pain shooting up through her hip. She cried out, the sound stolen instantly by the wind, and fell back into the snow that was already accumulating around her like a burial shroud. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized she couldn't see more than a foot in any direction. The world had become nothing but white and cold, and the terrible certainty that she was going to die here, alone, frozen solid before morning came. If morning ever came. The blizzard seemed eternal, as if God himself had decided winter would last forever, and this barren stretch of Colorado wilderness would be her tomb. She screamed then, screamed until her throat was raw, screamed her father's name and her mother's name, and finally just screamed wordless terror into the storm. Her voice broke, and she screamed anyway, because the alternative was to lie still and let the snow cover her completely. Better to die fighting than to simply give up. She was 19 years old, and she had survived the journey from Missouri, survived river crossings and summer heat, and the death of her younger brother from fever. She refused to let a snowstorm be her end. The cold was beginning to feel almost warm now, which some distant part of her mind recognized as a very bad sign. Her fingers had stopped hurting and gone numb. Her toes might as well have been made of wood. She could feel herself starting to drift, her eyelids growing heavy despite her best efforts to keep them open. Maybe if she just rested for a moment, just closed her eyes for a heartbeat or two. The snow was soft, softer than any feather bed, and it would be so easy to just let go. She was nearly gone when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, deeper and rhythmic. Hoofbeats. Someone was riding through the blizzard, and they were getting closer. Tessa forced her eyes open and screamed again, putting every ounce of strength she had left into that one desperate sound. Please, she thought, please hear me. Please don't pass by. Please. The hoofbeats stopped. For a terrible moment, there was nothing but the wind, and Tessa thought she had imagined it, that her dying brain had conjured hope out of nothing. Then a shape materialized out of the white, dark and solid and blessedly real. A horse, massive and steaming, and on its back a man who swung down with the easy grace of someone born in the saddle. He was at her side in an instant, dropping to his knees in the snow. "Christ almighty," he said, and his voice cut through the storm like a knife. "Can you hear me? Can you move?" "My leg," Tessa managed, her own voice sounding strange and distant. "I think it is broken." She couldn't see his face clearly through the snow that caked her eyelashes, but she saw him nod once, sharp and decisive. "I am going to pick you up," he said. "It is going to hurt. I am sorry for that, but we have got to get you out of this, or you will be dead before the hour is out." He didn't wait for her agreement. Strong arms slid beneath her, one under her shoulders and one under her knees, and then he was lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. The movement sent agony lancing through her injured leg, and she cried out, her hands scrabbling for purchase and finding the rough fabric of his coat. She clutched at it desperately as he turned toward his horse. "I have got you," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her believe him. "Hold on to me. Do not let go." Getting her onto the horse was a nightmare of pain and awkward maneuvering, but somehow he managed it, settling her in front of the saddle before swinging up behind her. His arms came around her on either side, holding the reins but also holding her in place, and the solid warmth of his chest against her back was the most wonderful thing Tessa had ever felt. She sagged against him, unable to help herself, and felt him adjust his grip to support her weight. "Stay awake," he commanded, his breath warm against her ear. "Talk to me. Tell me your name." "Tessa," she whispered. "Tessa Edwards." "Good. I am Garrett Cooper." "Where were you headed, Tessa Edwards?" "Montrose," she said, fighting to keep her eyes open as the horse began to move, picking its way carefully through the storm. "My father has a brother there. We were supposed to arrive 3 days ago, but the weather turned." "Montrose is a good 20 miles south of here," Garrett said. "We are not making it that far tonight. I have got a line shack about 2 miles west. It is not much, but it has got 4 walls and a stove. Can you hold on that long?" Tessa wasn't sure she could hold on for another minute, but she nodded anyway. She had to. The alternative was unthinkable. "Yes," she said. "I can hold on." He made a sound that might have been approval and urged the horse forward. The ride that followed existed in Tessa's memory as a blur of cold and pain and the steady presence of the man behind her. Every time she started to slip away, his voice would pull her back, asking her questions that she struggled to answer. Did she have any siblings? What was Missouri like? Had she ever seen the mountains before coming west? She answered as best she could, her words slurring together, while he kept talking, kept her tethered to consciousness through sheer force of will. By the time they reached the line shack, Tessa was barely aware of her surroundings. She had a vague impression of Garrett dismounting and then lifting her down, carrying her through a door that he had to kick open because his hands were full. Then she was being lowered onto something soft, a narrow bunk with a thin mattress that felt like heaven compared to the frozen ground, and blankets were being piled on top of her. "Do not go to sleep yet," Garrett said, his face appearing above her. She could see him properly now in the dim interior of the shack, and even through her haze of exhaustion and pain, she registered that he was young, perhaps only a handful of years older than she was, with dark hair and eyes that were almost gray. There was nothing soft about his face. It was all hard angles and weathered skin, the face of a man who spent his life outdoors. But his hands were gentle as they checked her over, cataloging her injuries with practiced efficiency. "I need to look at your leg. Where else are you hurt?" "My shoulder," Tessa said. "I landed on it when I fell. And my hands, I cannot feel my hands." "Frostbite, most likely," Garrett said grimly. He had moved to her feet and was pulling off her boots, which were soaked through. Her stockings followed, and Tessa made a weak noise of protest at the impropriety that died in her throat when she saw the waxy white color of her toes. "Not as bad as it could be," Garrett said, more to himself than to her. "You were not out there long enough for the worst of it. We need to warm you up slowly. Too fast, and it will do more harm than good." He worked with quiet efficiency, building up the fire in the small pot-bellied stove until the shack began to lose its bitter chill. He brought her water from a canteen and held her head while she drank, then wrapped her hands and feet in strips of cloth that he warmed by the stove first. Only when he was satisfied that she was in no immediate danger did he turn his attention to her leg. "This is going to hurt," he warned, moving to sit on the edge of the bunk. "I need to check if the bone is broken or just badly bruised. Try not to move." Tessa bit down on her lower lip as his hands carefully probed her injured leg through her skirts. The pain was intense but bearable until he reached a spot just above her knee, and then she couldn't stop the gasp that escaped her. Garrett's hands stilled immediately. "There," he said softly. "Feels like a clean break. You are lucky, all things considered. I am going to need to splint it, and I am going to need to do it properly, which means I am going to need to see the leg itself. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Heat flooded Tessa's cheeks despite the cold. She understood exactly what he was saying. "Yes," she whispered. "I will be as respectful as I can be," Garrett said, meeting her eyes. "But this needs to be done right. An improperly set leg can leave you lame for life." "I understand," Tessa said, and she did. Propriety mattered very little when weighed against the ability to walk. "Do what you must." He nodded and turned away to gather supplies, giving her a moment to compose herself. When he returned, he had strips of cloth and 2 straight pieces of wood that looked like they had been broken off from something else. He knelt beside the bunk and very carefully began to work her skirts up past her knee, his movements impersonal and clinical. Tessa fixed her gaze on the ceiling and tried to pretend she was anywhere else. The sound she made when he straightened the leg was somewhere between a scream and a sob. Black spots danced across her vision, and she thought she might actually faint. But Garrett kept talking to her in that steady voice, telling her she was doing fine, that the worst was almost over, just a little longer. His hands moved with surprising gentleness as he positioned the splints and began to bind them in place, wrapping the cloth tight enough to hold everything secure, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. "There," he said finally, sitting back. "That should hold until we can get you to a proper doctor. How are you feeling?" "Like I was thrown from a wagon and broke my leg," Tessa said weakly, and was rewarded with the ghost of a smile. "Fair enough," Garrett said. He stood and moved back to the stove, ladling something from a pot that Tessa hadn't even noticed him put on to heat. "Can you eat? You need something warm in you." The smell that reached her was rich and savory, some kind of stew, and Tessa's stomach growled despite everything. "I think so," she said. Garrett helped her sit up, propping her against the wall with the saddle blanket behind her back, and then handed her a tin cup filled with the steaming stew. Tessa wrapped her cloth-covered hands around it carefully, letting the warmth seep into her frozen fingers, and took a tentative sip. It was good, better than good, thick with meat and vegetables, and seasoned with something she couldn't quite identify. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, while Garrett settled onto a three-legged stool near the stove and ate his own portion. Outside, the wind continued to howl, rattling the shack's single window and finding every crack in the walls. But inside, with the fire burning and hot food in her belly, Tessa felt herself beginning to thaw in more ways than one. The pain in her leg had settled into a dull, constant ache, and her hands and feet were starting to tingle as feeling returned to them. It was an uncomfortable sensation, but a welcome one. It meant she wasn't going to lose any fingers or toes. "Your family?" Garrett said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "The wagon you were on. Do you know which direction they were headed?" The question brought reality crashing back, and Tessa felt her throat tighten. "South," she said, "toward Montrose. My father, he would have tried to turn back, would he not? When he realized I was gone?" Garrett's expression was carefully neutral. In this storm, turning back would be suicide. If he has any sense at all, he will have kept going and found shelter. Come morning, when the blizzard passes, we can ride out and look for signs of them. The road to Montrose is well traveled. If they made it through, someone will know. "And if they did not make it through?" Tessa asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "Then we will deal with that when we know for certain," Garrett said firmly. "No sense borrowing trouble. For now, you need to rest and let your body heal. We are not going anywhere until this storm blows itself out, and that could be another day at least. Another day trapped in a one-room shack with a strange man. Under any other circumstances, Tessa would have been horrified at the impropriety. But these were not normal circumstances, and Garrett Cooper had quite literally saved her life. She owed him everything, and propriety seemed like a small price to pay for survival. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming after me, for hearing my screams. I thought I was going to die out there." "You would have," Garrett said bluntly. "Another hour and you would have been frozen solid. What in God's name was your father thinking, traveling in weather like this?" "It was not like this when we set out this morning," Tessa said, defensive despite her exhaustion. "The sky was clear. We thought we could make Montrose by nightfall." "Mountain weather changes fast," Garrett said. "Your father should have known that. Should have been watching the sky, should have made camp the moment the first flakes started to fall." He was right, Tessa knew, but it still stung to hear it said so plainly. "He is a farmer," she said, "from Missouri. He does not know the mountains like you do." Garrett's expression softened slightly. "No," he agreed. "I suppose he does not. I am sorry. I should not be speaking ill of a man I have never met, especially when his daughter is sitting right in front of me. It has just been a long day." "What were you doing out in the storm?" Tessa asked, curious despite herself. "Were you checking on cattle?" "Something like that," Garrett said. "I work for the Triple C Ranch, about 15 miles from here. We have got herds scattered all over these mountains. And when a storm like this blows in, someone has got to make sure the line shacks are stocked and the water is not frozen over. I was headed back to the main ranch when I heard you screaming. You must have very good hearing," Tessa said, "to have heard me over that wind." "I almost did not," Garrett admitted. "I was maybe 100 yards past where you were lying when I thought I heard something. At first I figured it was just the wind playing tricks, but something made me turn back. Call it instinct or luck or divine providence. Whatever it was, I am glad I listened to it." "So am I," Tessa said fervently. They fell silent again, and Tessa found her eyelids growing heavy. The warmth of the shack, the food in her stomach, and the sheer exhaustion of what she had been through were all catching up with her. She tried to fight it, tried to stay awake, but it was a losing battle. "Sleep," Garrett said, noticing her struggle. "You are safe here. I will keep the fire going." "Where will you sleep?" Tessa asked, glancing around the small shack. There was only the one bunk, and it was barely wide enough for her. "I will make do," Garrett said. "I have slept in worse places than this, believe me. Go on now. Rest." Tessa wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he take the bunk since this was his line shack after all, but she was too tired to form the words. She let her eyes close, let herself sink into the thin mattress, and within moments, she was asleep. She woke once in the night to find the shack still dark, except for the glow from the stove. Garrett was sitting on the floor beside the bunk, his back against the wall and a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He seemed to be asleep, his head tilted back and his breathing deep and even. Tessa watched him for a moment, this stranger who had ridden into a blizzard to save her, and felt something shift in her chest. Gratitude certainly, but something else as well, something warmer and more complicated. She closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep, and this time, her dreams were peaceful. Morning came slowly, the darkness outside the window gradually giving way to a gray half-light. The wind had finally died down to something almost reasonable, though snow was still falling in thick, heavy flakes. Tessa woke to find Garrett already up, feeding more wood into the stove and setting a pot of coffee to boil. "How are you feeling?" he asked when he noticed her eyes were open. "Sore," Tessa said honestly, pushing herself up on her elbows. "But better than last night." "Good," Garrett said. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one to her, helping her sit up enough to drink without spilling. "We are not going anywhere today. The snow is too deep and still coming down too hard. Tomorrow, if it clears, we will try to make it back to the ranch. They have got a bunkhouse there with real beds, and we can send someone into Montrose to look for your family." "Another day," Tessa said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. The tingling in her fingers had intensified overnight, a sign that the frostbite was healing, but it made holding things awkward. "I am sorry to be such a burden." "You are not a burden," Garrett said firmly. "You are an injured woman who needs help. There is a difference." "Still," Tessa said, "you have your own work to do. I am keeping you from it." "The work will wait," Garrett said. "The cattle know how to take care of themselves in a storm better than most people do. They will find shelter and wait it out, same as we are." He moved back to the stove and began preparing breakfast, which turned out to be salt pork fried in a pan, and hard biscuits softened in the grease. It was simple fare, but Tessa ate gratefully, surprised by how hungry she was. Her body was demanding fuel to heal itself, and she was more than happy to oblige. As they ate, Garrett asked her more about her family, about the journey west and what had prompted her father to leave Missouri. Tessa found herself talking more freely than she had expected, telling him about the farm they had left behind, about the debts that had piled up after several bad harvests, about her father's brother who had written letters full of promises about the opportunities waiting in Colorado. She told him about her mother, who had not wanted to leave, but had gone anyway because that was what a wife did, and about her younger sister Margaret, who was 16 and terrified of everything west of the Mississippi. "You have got grit, though," Garrett observed. "Coming out here takes courage." "Or desperation," Tessa said wryly. "We did not have much choice in the matter." "Still," Garrett said, "a lot of people would have just given up. Your father could have sold the farm for whatever he could get and moved to a city, tried to find work in a factory. Instead, he brought his family across half the country to start over. That takes a special kind of stubborn." "Stubbornness runs in my family," Tessa said with a small smile. "My mother says I got more than my fair share of it." "I believe that," Garrett said, and there was something in his eyes that made Tessa's breath catch. "You were stubborn enough to keep screaming when most people would have given up and accepted their fate. Stubborn enough to hold on during that ride, even though you could barely stay conscious. That kind of stubborn will serve you well out here." The day passed slowly, but not unpleasantly. They talked more, filling the hours with stories and observations. Tessa learned that Garrett was 23 years old and had been working on the Triple C Ranch for 5 years, ever since he had aged out of the orphanage in Denver. He had no family to speak of, no ties beyond the ranch and the men he worked with, but he did not seem bitter about it. If anything, he spoke of his life with a quiet satisfaction that Tessa found both foreign and appealing. In turn, she told him more about her own life, about the small town in Missouri. where everyone knew everyone else's business, about the church socials and barn dances that had been the highlight of her social life. She told him about the boy she had almost married before his family moved to Kansas, and about the relief she had felt when he left, because she had not loved him, not really. And the idea of spending the rest of her life with him had felt like a slowly tightening noose. "So you are not promised to anyone, then?" Garrett asked, and there was something carefully casual about the question that made Tessa's heart skip. "No," she said, "I am not promised to anyone." He nodded, his expression unreadable, and changed the subject to the weather. But the moment hung between them, charged with possibility, and Tessa found herself thinking about it long after the conversation had moved on. That night, Garrett insisted she take the bunk again, while he made himself a bed on the floor. Tessa argued that it was not fair, that he had already given up his bed once, and she could manage on the floor just as well, but he was immovable on the subject. "You have got a broken leg," he pointed out. "Getting up and down off the floor would be hell on it. Besides, I am used to sleeping rough. This floor is downright comfortable compared to some of the places I have bedded down." Tessa wanted to argue further, but she could see it would be pointless. Garrett Cooper was the kind of man who made up his mind and then stuck to it, no matter what anyone else had to say about it. It was frustrating and admirable in equal measure. She settled into the bunk and pulled the blankets up to her chin, watching as Garrett banked the fire for the night, and then stretched out on the floor with his saddle for a pillow. He looked uncomfortable, all long limbs and hard angles, but within minutes his breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep. Tessa lay awake longer, her mind racing despite her body's exhaustion. She kept thinking about what would happen tomorrow when they left the line shack and made their way to the C Ranch. What if her family had not made it to Montrose? What if the wagon had overturned, or her father had gotten lost in the storm? The possibilities were endless and terrifying, and she had to forcibly push them away before they could consume her. Instead, she found herself thinking about Garrett, about the way he had ridden into the storm without hesitation, about the gentleness of his hands when he had set her leg, about the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She barely knew him, had known him less than a full day, but she felt drawn to him in a way she had never experienced before. It was more than gratitude, though she was certainly grateful. It was something deeper, something that felt almost like recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting for him without even knowing it. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it felt right, as natural as breathing. She fell asleep with that thought warming her from the inside, better than any fire could. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to stretch on forever. The blizzard had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. When Garrett opened the door, Tessa gasped at the sight. Everything was white, pristine, and untouched, sparkling in the early morning sun like a field of diamonds. "Must be 3 feet deep in places," Garrett said, surveying the scene with a practiced eye. "Going to make the ride slow, but we should be able to manage it. How is your leg this morning?" "It hurts," Tessa admitted, "but no worse than yesterday. I think I can ride if you help me." "We will take it slow," Garrett promised. He moved to tend to his horse, which he had sheltered in a lean-to attached to the side of the shack, and Tessa used the time to make herself as presentable as possible. She finger-combed her hair and braided it, washed her face with water from the bucket Garrett had filled with melted snow, and tried not to think about how improper it was that she had spent 2 nights alone with a man who was not her husband or even her kin. The ride to the C Ranch was every bit as slow and difficult as Garrett had predicted. The snow was deep enough that the horse struggled in places, and every jolt sent fresh pain shooting through Tessa's leg. But Garrett kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the ranch and the men who worked there, and somehow that made it bearable. It was nearly noon when they finally arrived at the ranch, and Tessa's first impression was of organized chaos. There were several buildings scattered across a wide valley, including a large main house, a bunkhouse, a barn, and various other structures whose purposes she could only guess at. Cattle dotted the snow-covered hills in the distance, dark shapes against the white, and smoke rose from multiple chimneys into the clear blue sky. Garrett guided his horse toward the main house, and before they had even come to a complete stop, the front door flew open and a man emerged. He was older than Garrett, perhaps in his 40s, with graying hair and a weathered face that broke into a grin when he saw them. "Cooper!" he called out. "We were starting to think you had frozen to death out there. Who have you got with you?" "This is Tessa Edwards," Garrett said, swinging down from the saddle. She got separated from her family's wagon during the storm, broke her leg in the fall. I found her and brought her back to the line shack until the weather cleared. The older man's expression turned serious. Separated from her family? When was this? 2 nights ago, Tessa said, speaking up for herself. They were headed to Montrose. I am hoping someone might have news of them. Let us get you inside first, the man said. I am John Callahan. I own this ranch. We will get you settled and then see what we can find out about your folks. Garrett lifted Tessa down from the horse with the same easy strength he had shown before, and John Callahan held the door while Garrett carried her into the house. The interior was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and Tessa felt herself relax slightly despite her worry about her family. They settled her in a chair in the front room, and John's wife appeared, a plump woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her name was Martha, and she clucked over Tessa like a mother hen, bringing her coffee and food and a blanket to wrap around her shoulders. Poor dear, Martha said. What an ordeal you have been through. John, send someone into Montrose right away to ask about her family. Already planned on it, John said. He turned to Garrett. You up for the ride, Cooper? Or should I send Collins? I will go, Garrett said without hesitation. I know what I am looking for. He left within the hour, and the waiting that followed was the hardest thing Tessa had ever endured. Martha tried to distract her with conversation and offers of food, but Tessa could barely focus on anything except the window and the road beyond it. Every minute felt like an hour, and every hour felt like a day. It was late afternoon when Garrett finally returned, and Tessa knew from the expression on his face that he had news. She sat up straighter, her hands gripping the arms of the chair, as he came into the room and removed his hat. I found them, he said, and Tessa felt her knees go weak with relief, even though she was already sitting down. They made it to Montrose. Your father reported you missing to the sheriff, and they were organizing a search party to come looking for you as soon as the weather permitted. They are staying at the Montrose Hotel. I told the sheriff you were safe and gave him directions here. They are alive, Tessa whispered, and then she was crying, great gasping sobs of relief that she could not have held back if her life depended on it. They are alive, and they are safe. Martha was there immediately, wrapping her arms around Tessa and making soothing sounds. Garrett stood awkwardly in the doorway, looking uncomfortable with the display of emotion, but when Tessa looked up and met his eyes, she saw understanding there. He knew what it was like to have no family, and he understood what it meant to her to know hers was safe. Thank you, she managed to say through her tears. Thank you so much. They should be here tomorrow, Garrett said. The sheriff said your father would want to come as soon as possible. I am glad I could bring you good news. He retreated then, leaving Tessa to Martha's ministrations, but Tessa found herself watching the door long after he had gone. She wanted to talk to him, to thank him properly for everything he had done. But Martha was already bustling about, talking about getting Tessa cleaned up and into some proper clothes, and maybe looking at that leg again to make sure it was healing properly. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Martha helped her bathe, an awkward affair that involved sitting on a chair with her splinted leg propped up, while Martha washed her hair and helped her scrub away the grime of the past few days. She lent Tessa a clean dress and a nightgown, both of which had to be adjusted to fit Tessa's taller frame. By the time she was finished, Tessa felt more human than she had since before the blizzard, though her legs still throbbed with every heartbeat. Martha settled her in a small bedroom on the first floor, explaining that climbing stairs would be too difficult with her injury. The bed was soft and comfortable, a far cry from the thin mattress in the line shack, and Tessa sank into it gratefully. But despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive. She kept thinking about her family, about how close she had come to never seeing them again, and about Garrett Cooper, who had saved her life and then disappeared before she could tell him how much it meant to her. She saw him the next morning at breakfast, which Martha insisted she take at the table, despite Tessa's protests that she did not want to be any trouble. Garrett came in from the bunkhouse with several other ranch hands, all of them stamping snow off their boots and bringing the cold in with them. He nodded to her when he caught her eye, a small acknowledgement, but then turned his attention to his food and the conversation flowing around the table. Tessa found herself watching him, studying the way he moved and spoke, the easy camaraderie he had with the other men. He belonged here in a way she envied, secure in his place and his purpose. What must it be like, she wondered, to be so certain of where you fit in the world? Her father arrived just after noon, riding in at the head of a small group that included the sheriff and Tessa's mother and sister. Tessa heard the commotion outside and tried to stand, forgetting momentarily about her leg. She would have fallen if Garrett had not appeared seemingly out of nowhere to steady her. "Easy," he said, his hands on her shoulders. "You do not want to undo all that healing." "My family," Tessa said, looking up at him. "They are here." "I know," Garrett said. "I will help you outside." He supported her as she hobbled to the front door, and then her mother was there, pulling her into an embrace so tight Tessa could barely breathe. Her father was right behind, his face gray with worry, but breaking into a smile of pure relief when he saw her. Even Margaret was crying, throwing her arms around Tessa's neck and babbling about how scared she had been. "We thought you were dead," her mother kept saying over and over. "We thought we had lost you." "I almost was," Tessa said honestly. "But Garrett found me. He saved my life." Her father turned to Garrett then, who had stepped back to give the family space. "Is that true?" he asked. "You saved my daughter?" "I heard her screaming and went to help," Garrett said, looking uncomfortable with the attention. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Tessa's father said firmly. "Not anyone would have ridden into a blizzard on the chance that what they heard was a person in trouble. Not anyone would have risked their own life for a stranger. I owe you a debt I can never repay, Mr. Cooper." "You do not owe me anything," Garrett said. "I am just glad I was in the right place at the right time." But Tessa's father was not satisfied with that. He insisted on shaking Garrett's hand, on thanking him over and over, and Tessa could see Garrett growing more uncomfortable with each passing moment. He was not a man who sought praise or recognition, she realized. He had done what he thought was right, and that was enough for him. The reunion was both joyful and bittersweet. Tessa's family stayed for several hours, catching her up on what had happened after she fell from the wagon. Her father had indeed tried to turn back, but the storm had been so fierce and the wind so strong that he had not been able to see more than a few feet in any direction. Her mother had been hysterical, and Margaret had been crying, and finally her father had made the decision to keep going, to get his remaining family to safety, and then organize a search as soon as possible. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have been more careful, should have watched the weather more closely, should have made sure you were secured better in the wagon." "It was not your fault," Tessa said firmly. "It was an accident, and I am fine, bruised and broken but alive, and that is what matters." But she could see the guilt in his eyes, and she knew he would carry it with him for a long time. Eventually, the conversation turned to practical matters. What would happen now? Where would Tessa stay while her leg healed? Her father's plan had been to take her back to Montrose with them, where they had rented a small house near her uncle's property. But Martha Callahan had other ideas. "The girl cannot be bounced around in a wagon for 20 miles with a broken leg," she said firmly. "It would set her healing back weeks, maybe longer. She should stay here until the bone has knit properly. We have got the space, and I would be happy for the company." Tessa's mother looked uncertain, but her father was nodding. "If it would not be too much trouble," he said, "we would be happy to pay for her board." "Nonsense," Martha said. "After what she has been through, the least we can do is give her a place to recover. Besides, having another woman around will be a pleasant change. This house can feel awfully empty sometimes." And so it was decided. Tessa would stay at the Triple C Ranch until her leg had healed enough for her to travel safely. Her family would return to Montrose and get settled, and in a few weeks, they would come back to collect her. It seemed like a reasonable plan, and Tessa was relieved that she would not have to endure another wagon ride so soon after the last one. Her family left before dark, wanting to make it back to Montrose before nightfall. Tessa stood on the porch and watched them go, leaning on the crutch that John Callahan had fashioned for her, and felt a confusing mix of emotions. She was glad they were safe, glad she would see them again soon, but part of her was also relieved to see them go. The constant fussing and worrying had been exhausting, and the quiet of the ranch felt like a blessing by comparison. "You all right?" a voice asked, and Tessa turned to find Garrett standing a few feet away. "Yes," she said, "just tired. It has been an eventful few days." "That is one way to put it," Garrett said. He moved to stand beside her, his eyes on the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "Your folks seem nice." "They are," Tessa said. "They can be a bit overprotective sometimes, especially my mother, but they mean well." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple. Finally, Garrett spoke again. "I am glad you are staying for a while," he said. I am glad you will have time to heal properly before you have to travel again. Not that I am glad you broke your leg in the first place. Obviously." Tessa hid a smile at his awkwardness. "I know what you meant," she said gently. "And I am glad too. I feel safe here." "Good," Garrett said. "That is good." He fell silent again, but he did not leave, and Tessa found herself grateful for his presence. There was something solid and reassuring about him, something that made her feel grounded even when her world had been turned upside down. She was glad she would have more time to get to know him, to understand the man who had saved her life. The days that followed settled into a pleasant routine. Tessa spent her mornings in the kitchen with Martha, learning to bake bread and churn butter, and do all the other tasks that running a household required. Her leg was still healing, so she could not stand for long periods, but Martha found ways to keep her occupied that did not require much movement. Tessa found herself enjoying the work, enjoying the feeling of being useful after days of helpless dependency. The afternoons were her own, and she usually spent them in the front room with a book from the Callahan's modest library, or watching the activity of the ranch through the window. Sometimes Martha would sit with her, and they would talk, Martha sharing stories about the early days of the ranch and the adventures she and John had experienced. Other times, Tessa would simply sit and think, processing everything that had happened and trying to come to terms with how close she had come to death. Garrett usually appeared around dinner time, coming in from whatever work had occupied his day. He would wash up at the pump outside and then join them for the evening meal, which was always served family style with John and Martha and whichever ranch hands happened to be at the main house. The conversation was lively and often loud, full of jokes and stories and good-natured ribbing, and Tessa found herself laughing more than she had in months. After dinner, Garrett often lingered, and they would talk while Martha cleaned up and John attended to paperwork in his study. Sometimes they played cards or checkers. Sometimes they just sat by the fire and talked about anything and everything. Tessa learned more about his childhood in the orphanage, about the harsh discipline and the constant hunger, and the overwhelming sense of being unwanted. But she also learned about the moments of kindness, the teacher who had taught him to read, the older boy who had looked out for him, the day he had been hired by the CCC, and finally felt like he had found a place where he belonged. In turn, she told him more about her own life, about the friends she had left behind in Missouri and the dreams she had harbored as a girl. She had always wanted to travel, to see more of the world than the small town where she had grown up. Coming west had been terrifying, but also exhilarating, a chance to experience something new and different. "What will you do in Montrose?" Garrett asked one evening. They were sitting by the fire, Tessa in her usual chair, and Garrett on the floor with his back against the hearth. "Do you have plans beyond helping your family get settled?" "I suppose I will do whatever needs doing," Tessa said. "Help my mother with the house, maybe find work in town if there is any to be had." "Why do you ask?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the flames. "I was just wondering," he said finally. "Wondering what your life will look like. Wondering if you will be happy." "I do not know if happy is the right word," Tessa admitted, "but I will make the best of it. That is what we do, is it not? Make the best of whatever life gives us." "I suppose so," Garrett said. He turned to look at her then, and there was something in his eyes that made Tessa's breath catch. "But you deserve more than just making the best of things. You deserve to be happy. Truly happy." "So do you," Tessa said softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibility. Then Martha called from the kitchen that she needed help with something, and the spell was broken. Garrett stood and offered Tessa his hand to help her up, and they went to see what Martha needed, but Tessa could not stop thinking about what he had said, about the way he had looked at her, about the way her heart had responded. The weeks passed faster than Tessa would have thought possible. Her leg healed slowly but steadily, the pain gradually diminishing until it was nothing more than a dull ache. She graduated from the crutch to a cane, and then from the cane to walking on her own, though she still limped slightly. The doctor who came from Montrose to check on her progress declared himself satisfied and said she would likely make a full recovery given time. As her mobility improved, Tessa began to explore the ranch more fully. She would bundle up against the cold and walk out to the barn to see the horses, or stand on the ridge behind the main house and look out at the mountains rising in the distance. Everything about this place was so different from Missouri, wilder and more rugged, and she found herself falling in love with it despite the hardships it presented. She also found herself falling in love with Garrett Cooper, though she tried hard not to admit it even to herself. It seemed too fast, too improbable. She had known him less than a month. How could she possibly be in love with him? But the feeling was undeniable, growing stronger with every conversation, every shared smile, every moment spent in his presence. She knew the way he took his coffee without asking. She knew that he had a scar on his left hand from a rope burn. She knew that he hummed under his breath when he was concentrating, always the same tune, something she suspected he was not even aware of doing. And she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that he felt the same way about her. It was there in the way his eyes sought her out across a crowded room, in the way he always seemed to find an excuse to be wherever she was, in the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if every word she said mattered, but neither of them spoke of it. Neither of them acknowledged what was growing between them, perhaps because putting it into words would make it real, and making it real would force them to confront the fact that Tessa's time at the ranch was drawing to a close. Her father had written to say he would come for her in the first week of March, just over a month since the blizzard. The letter arrived on a Friday, and Tessa held it in her hands and felt her heart sink. She should have been happy. She should have been eager to reunite with her family and start her new life in Montrose. But all she could think about was leaving Garrett behind. That evening, she walked out to the barn where she knew he would be tending to the horses. It was cold but clear, the sky full of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. She found him in the last stall, brushing down the big roan gelding he favored, and he looked up when he heard her footsteps. "Tessa," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing out here? It is cold." "I needed to talk to you," Tessa said. She leaned against the stall door, suddenly nervous. "My father is coming for me next week." Garrett's hand stilled on the brush. "Next week," he repeated. "That is soon." "Yes," Tessa said. "I suppose my leg is healed well enough that there is no reason for me to stay any longer." "I suppose not," Garrett said, but his voice was flat, carefully neutral. "Garrett," Tessa said, and her voice caught. "I do not want to go." He set the brush down and turned to face her fully. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I do not want to leave," Tessa said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know that probably sounds foolish. I know we have not known each other very long. But these past weeks being here, getting to know you, it has been the happiest I have been in a long time, maybe ever. And the thought of leaving, of never seeing you again, it makes me feel like I cannot breathe." Garrett crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He took her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palms, and looked at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I have been in love with you since the moment I pulled you out of that snowbank," he said, his voice rough. "Maybe before that. Maybe from the first second I heard you screaming and knew I had to find you. I have been trying so hard not to say anything because I did not want to presume, did not want to make you feel obligated just because I saved your life. But if you are telling me you feel the same way, if you are telling me you do not want to leave, then I am going to do something I probably should have done weeks ago." "What is that?" Tessa whispered. "This," Garrett said, and then he was kissing her. It was not Tessa's first kiss. There had been the boy in Missouri, a few fumbling attempts at romance that had left her underwhelmed and confused about what all the fuss was about. But this was different. This was everything those other kisses had not been. Garrett kissed her like she was precious, like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life, and Tessa felt herself melt into him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me?" he said. "I know it is too fast. I know I should court you properly, should ask your father's permission, should do all the things a man is supposed to do. But I cannot let you leave without at least asking. Marry me, Tessa. Stay here with me. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Tessa said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Garrett pulled back to look at her, his eyes searching hers as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. "Yes?" he repeated. "Yes," Tessa said again, laughing through the tears that were streaming down her face. "Yes, Garrett Cooper, I will marry you." He kissed her again, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around despite the cramped confines of the stall. The horse snorted in protest at the commotion, and they broke apart laughing, giddy with joy and relief, and the sheer impossibility of what they had just agreed to. "We should tell the Callahans," Garrett said, "and I should write to your father, ask for his blessing. He deserves to know my intentions before he arrives." "He will say yes," Tessa said confidently. "You saved my life. He already thinks of you as a hero." "Saving your life and marrying you are two very different things," Garrett pointed out. "He might not be as enthusiastic about handing his daughter over to a cowboy with no prospects beyond a job on someone else's ranch." "Then we will convince him," Tessa said. "Together. But Garrett, I need you to know that whatever he says, my answer will not change. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you. And if my father cannot accept that, then we will find a way to make it work anyway." Garrett pulled her close again, tucking her head under his chin. "I do not deserve you," he said softly, "but I am going to spend every day trying to be worthy of you anyway." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the horses shifted and settled around them. Finally, the cold drove them back inside, where they found Martha and John in the kitchen, sharing a late cup of coffee. "We have news," Garrett said, his hand firmly clasped around Tessa's. "I have asked Tessa to marry me, and she has said yes. I know I should have spoken to you first, Mr. Callahan. I should have done things properly. But I need you both to know that I am serious about this. I love her, and I want to spend my life with her." Martha let out a delighted squeal and immediately pulled Tessa into a hug. "Oh, I knew it," she said. "I knew from the moment Garrett brought you here that there was something special between you two. I am so happy for you both." John was more reserved, but when he shook Garrett's hand, there was warmth in his eyes. "You are a good man, Cooper," he said, "and if Tessa has agreed to marry you, then I have no objections. But her father might feel differently. Have you thought about how you will approach him?" "I am going to write to him tonight," Garrett said. "Ask for his permission and his blessing. And if he wants to come here before he makes a decision, to talk to me in person, then I will respect that. I want to do this right." John nodded approvingly. "That is the smart way to handle it. And for what it is worth, I will be happy to speak on your behalf, if it comes to that. You have been a good employee and a good man. Any father would be lucky to have you as a son-in-law." The letter was duly written and sent, and then came the hardest part: waiting for a response. Tessa found herself alternating between elation and anxiety. What if her father said no? What if he demanded she return to Montrose and forbade her from seeing Garrett again? She was of age, legally able to make her own decisions, but she did not want to cause a rift with her family. She wanted their blessing, wanted them to be happy for her. The reply came faster than expected, arriving just 3 days later. Tessa's father would indeed come to the ranch, and he would come alone, wanting to speak with Garrett man to man before making any decisions. The tone of the letter was cautious but not hostile, which Tessa took as a good sign. When the appointed day arrived, Tessa was a bundle of nerves. She had dressed carefully in her best borrowed dress, had arranged her hair 3 times before finally leaving it alone, and had worn a path in the floor with her pacing. Garrett was no better, disappearing to the bunkhouse to change clothes twice and then standing stiffly by the window, watching for the first sign of a rider. When her father finally arrived, John Callahan invited all of them into his study for the discussion. It was a small room lined with books and papers, dominated by a large desk, and it felt almost suffocating with 4 people crowded inside. But Tessa appreciated the privacy. Whatever was going to be said, it should be said away from prying ears. Her father got straight to the point. "Mr. Cooper," he said, "my daughter tells me you wish to marry her." "Yes, sir," Garrett said. "I do." "You have known each other less than 2 months," Tessa's father continued. "That is not very long to make such a serious decision." "No, sir, it is not," Garrett agreed. "But I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love your daughter. I want to take care of her, to build a life with her. I know I do not have much to offer right now. I am just a cowboy with no property of my own. But I am a hard worker, and I am saving money. In a few years, I will be able to buy my own land, start my own ranch. I will provide for her, sir. I will make her happy. You have my word on that." Tessa's father studied Garrett for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Tessa. "And you?" he asked. "Is this truly what you want? You are not feeling obligated because he saved your life?" "No," Tessa said firmly. "I am not feeling obligated. I love him, Father. I want to marry him. And I know it seems fast, but when you know, you know. Is that not what you always told me about you and Mother? That you knew within a week of meeting her that she was the one?" Her father's lips twitched. "I did say that," he admitted, "and your mother has never let me forget it." "Very well. I will give you my blessing, but on 2 conditions." "Anything," Garrett said immediately. "First, you will wait at least 2 more months before the wedding," Tessa's father said. "I want you both to be absolutely certain this is what you want. If you still feel the same way come May, then you have my full support." "That is fair," Garrett said, and Tessa nodded her agreement. "Second," her father continued, "you will let me give you a proper wedding. Nothing fancy, but something respectable. My daughter is not going to be married by some traveling preacher in the back of a saloon. We will do this right, with family present and a proper ceremony." "We would not want it any other way," Tessa said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you, Father. Thank you for understanding." Her father pulled her into a hug, and Tessa felt him sigh against her hair. "You scared 10 years off my life when you fell from that wagon," he said quietly. "All I want is for you to be happy and safe. If Garrett Cooper can give you that, then he has my blessing and my gratitude." The 2 months that followed were among the happiest of Tessa's life. She moved back to Montrose to live with her family, but Garrett rode in to visit every Sunday without fail. They talked for hours, making plans for their future, learning more about each other with every conversation. Tessa met some of the other ranch hands from the Triple C, who made it clear that they considered Garrett one of their own and were happy to see him settling down. Her mother and sister warmed to Garrett quickly, charmed by his quiet manners and obvious devotion to Tessa. The wedding was planned for the first Saturday in May, to be held in the small church in Montrose. It would be a simple affair, but Tessa did not care about elaborate decorations or fancy dresses. All she cared about was standing beside Garrett and promising to love him for the rest of her life. As the day approached, Tessa found herself thinking often about the night of the blizzard, about how close she had come to dying, how easily she could have been just another casualty of the harsh Colorado winter. But instead, she had been found. She had been saved. And in the process, she had found something she had not even known she was looking for, a love that felt like coming home. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect spring morning that felt like a blessing. Tessa dressed in a new gown that her mother had helped her sew, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Margaret wove wildflowers into her hair, chattering excitedly about how beautiful Tessa looked. Her father knocked on the door when it was time, and when Tessa took his arm to walk to the church, she saw tears in his eyes. "You look just like your mother did on our wedding day," he said. "I am so proud of you, Tessa, so proud of the woman you have become." "Thank you, Father," Tessa said, blinking back her own tears, "for everything, for bringing us out here, for understanding about Garrett, for giving me a chance at real happiness." "You would have found it regardless," her father said. "You have always been the strongest of all of us. I think you would have thrived anywhere." The church was small but full, packed with Tessa's family and friends from Montrose, as well as the Callahans and half the hands from the Triple C Ranch. Garrett stood at the front with the preacher, looking uncomfortable in a new suit, but impossibly handsome. When Tessa began her walk down the aisle and his eyes found hers, his whole face lit up with such joy that Tessa felt her breath catch. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Tessa was aware of the preacher's words, of making her vows in a voice that shook only slightly, of Garrett's hands warm and steady as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. But mostly she was aware of him, of the love shining in his eyes, of the way he looked at her as if she was the most precious thing in the world. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and told Garrett he could kiss his bride, he did so with a gentleness that brought tears to more than one person's eyes. It was a kiss full of promise, of hope, of a future stretching out before them, bright with possibility. The reception was held in the yard behind the church, with tables laden with food and drink. There was music and dancing and countless toasts to the happy couple. Tessa danced with her father and then with John Callahan, who told her she would always have a place at the Triple C if she ever needed it. But mostly she danced with Garrett, who held her close and whispered in her ear that he loved her, that he would always love her, that he could not believe how lucky he was. As the sun began to set and the party showed no signs of slowing down, Garrett took Tessa's hand and led her away from the crowd. They walked to the edge of the yard where they could see the mountains in the distance, purple and majestic against the orange sky. "Happy?" Garrett asked, pulling her into his arms. Happier than I have ever been, Tessa said honestly. Though I do keep thinking about how differently this all could have turned out. If you had not heard me that night, if you had decided the sound was just the wind, if you had been even a few minutes later. But I was not, Garrett said firmly. I was exactly where I needed to be, exactly when I needed to be there. Some things are meant to happen, Tessa. I truly believe that. You and me, we were meant to find each other. I believe that too, Tessa said. She leaned up to kiss him, soft and sweet, and felt him smile against her lips. They stayed at the Triple C Ranch for the first year of their marriage, living in a small cabin that John Callahan had built for them on the edge of his property. It was modest, just 2 rooms and a loft, but Tessa had never been happier. She made curtains for the windows and learned to cook on the temperamental wood stove. She tended a small garden and helped Martha with the housework when her own chores were done. And every evening, when Garrett came home from whatever work had occupied his day, she was there to greet him, and the joy on his face never faded. They talked often about their plans for the future. Garrett was still saving money, still dreaming of the day when they could buy their own land. Tessa encouraged him, helped him budget and plan, and dreamed alongside him of the ranch they would build together. But she was also content with where they were. The cabin might be small, but it was theirs. The life they were building might be simple, but it was filled with love. In the fall, Tessa discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Garrett one evening after dinner, simply placing his hand on her still flat stomach and watching his face as understanding dawned. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he was pulling her into his arms and burying his face in her hair. "A baby," he said, his voice muffled. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Tessa said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Garrett said. He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never thought I would have this. A wife, a home, a family. I used to think I was meant to be alone. And then you came into my life and changed everything." "You changed everything for me, too," Tessa said softly. "You saved me in more ways than one." The baby was born in the spring, a healthy boy with Garrett's dark hair and Tessa's blue eyes. They named him Thomas after Tessa's grandfather, and he became the center of their world. Garrett proved to be a devoted father, patient and gentle with the baby in a way that surprised even Tessa. She would often find him in the middle of the night, pacing the floor with Thomas in his arms, humming that same tune he always hummed when he was content. 2 years later, they had saved enough money to buy their own land, a beautiful parcel along the river, with good water and plenty of grass for cattle. Garrett built them a house with his own hands, larger than the cabin but still modest, with a wide porch and windows that looked out at the mountains. They moved in just before their daughter was born, a tiny thing with a surprisingly loud voice that Tessa named Grace because it seemed appropriate for a child born into such blessings. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, and all the myriad difficulties that came with trying to make a living from the land. But through it all, Tessa and Garrett faced everything together. They built their ranch slowly, adding cattle and horses, expanding the house as their family grew. Thomas was joined by Grace and then by another boy they named Samuel, and finally by a second daughter, Rose. Tessa's parents became regular visitors, making the trip from Montrose several times a year to see their grandchildren. Her father and Garrett developed a warm relationship, bonded by their shared love of the land and their mutual devotion to family. Margaret married a store owner in Montrose and had children of her own, and the cousins grew up playing together during summer visits. John and Martha Callahan remained close friends, often riding over for dinner or inviting Garrett and Tessa to the Triple C for celebrations. John became a mentor to Garrett, teaching him the business side of ranching, and when he passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 70, Garrett was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. As the children grew older and more independent, Tessa found time to pursue her own interests. She had always loved reading, and she began ordering books from back east, building a small library in their home. She started a school for the children in the area, teaching them reading and arithmetic in the front room during the winter months, when work on the ranch was slower. Garrett was proud of her, bragging to anyone who would listen about his wife, the teacher. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Tessa on a trip to Denver, just the two of them. It was the first time they had been away from the ranch and the children for more than a day, and Tessa felt strange without the constant demands of family life. But it was also wonderful, a chance to remember what it had been like when they were young and newly married, when it was just the two of them against the world. They stayed in a proper hotel with a real bathtub and ate dinner in a restaurant with white tablecloths. They walked through the city streets hand in hand, marveling at how much things had changed since Garrett had left the orphanage all those years ago. But mostly they just talked, catching up on all the conversations that had been interrupted by children's needs or ranch business, reconnecting in a way that made Tessa fall in love with him all over again. "Do you ever regret it?" Garrett asked one evening, as they sat on a bench watching the sunset. "The life we have built? Do you ever wish for something different? Something easier?" "Never," Tessa said without hesitation. "I have exactly the life I want, the life I chose. Do you regret it?" "Not for a single second," Garrett said. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Tessa Cooper. You and our children and the life we have built together. I would not change any of it." As they grew older, they began to slow down. Garrett hired more help for the ranch, men who could handle the physical labor that was becoming harder for him. Tessa cut back on her teaching as her vision started to fail, though she still read to the grandchildren when they came to visit. They sold off some of their cattle and leased out portions of their land, scaling back to something more manageable. Thomas took over much of the day-to-day operation of the ranch, proving himself to be as capable as his father. He had married a woman from Montrose, sweet-natured Sarah, and they had given Garrett and Tessa 5 grandchildren who ran wild across the property during summer visits. Grace had moved to Denver with her husband, a lawyer, but she wrote long letters and came home for holidays. Samuel had gone east to study medicine and now had a practice in Kansas, while Rose had married a rancher from Wyoming and had 4 children of her own. On the 50th anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together, Garrett took Tessa out to the spot where the old line shack had stood. It had fallen into disrepair years ago and eventually been torn down, but they both remembered exactly where it had been. They stood there in the spring sunshine, their hair gray and their bodies stooped with age, and Garrett pulled Tessa close. "I still hear your screams sometimes," he said quietly, "in my dreams, and I always wake up terrified that this time I will not find you, that this time you will be lost." "But you did find me," Tessa said, reaching up to cup his weathered cheek. "You found me, and you saved me, and you have been saving me every day since. I love you, Garrett Cooper. I have loved you for 50 years, and I will love you for however many years we have left." "I love you too," Garrett said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I can possibly say. Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy who had nothing to offer but his heart." "Your heart was all I ever needed," Tessa said, and kissed him there in the spring sunshine, surrounded by the mountains and the life they had built together. They had 10 more good years together. 10 years of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, of quiet evenings on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, of a love that had only deepened and strengthened with time. Garrett went first, passing quietly in his sleep one winter night with Tessa beside him. She held his hand as his breathing slowed and finally stopped, and though her heart was breaking, there was also peace. They had been so lucky, she thought, so incredibly blessed. She lived 2 more years without him, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, but always conscious of the empty space at her side. When her own time came, she went willingly, eager to see Garrett again, to continue the great adventure they had begun that night in the blizzard so many years ago. Thomas found her one morning in her favorite chair on the porch, a small smile on her face, as if she had seen something wonderful just before the end. In her lap was a worn leather journal filled with her careful handwriting. It was the story of her life, she had told him once. The story of how she had been thrown from a wagon in a blizzard, how a cowboy had heard her screams and rode into the white, how that single moment had changed everything. It was, Thomas thought as he gently closed the journal, the greatest love story he had ever known. And as he looked out at the mountains his parents had loved so much, he silently thanked whatever force had brought them together. Because without that blizzard, without that moment of fate, none of them would be here. The ranch would not exist, the family would not exist, and the world would be a much poorer place. He carried the journal inside and placed it on the shelf with the other family treasures, knowing that someday his own children would read it and understand. would know that they came from love, real and true and deep as the mountains themselves, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the hardest moments, from the storms we survive and the people who save us when we think all hope is lost. The ranch continued for generations after that, each new family adding their own stories to the legacy. But they all knew where it started, with a woman thrown from a wagon in a blizzard and a cowboy who heard her screams, with two people who found each other in the worst possible circumstances and chose to build something beautiful together, with a love that had started in desperation and fear, but had grown into something strong enough to weather any storm. And on winter nights, when the snow fell thick and the wind howled around the house, the family would gather by the fire and tell the story again, about how Tessa Edwards became Tessa Cooper, about how Garrett Cooper found his purpose in his home, about how one moment of courage in a blizzard changed everything for everyone who came after. It was a story worth telling, a story worth remembering, a story that proved that sometimes, when everything seems lost, salvation can come riding out of the white on a dark horse, carried by a man with a good heart and steady hands. And if you are lucky enough to be saved like that, if you are blessed enough to find that kind of love, then you hold on to it with everything you have and you never let go. That was the lesson Tessa and Garrett had taught them all. That was the legacy they left behind, and it was more valuable than all the land and cattle and buildings combined. It was the knowledge that love can bloom anywhere, even in the harshest conditions. That family is what you make it. That home is not a place, but a person. And that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful planning, but from blind chance and the willingness to ride into the storm when someone needs you. The Cooper Ranch still stands today, passed down through the generations, a testament to two people who refused to let circumstances define them, who chose love over fear, hope over despair, and built something that would outlast them both. Visitors often remark on how peaceful it feels there, how the mountains seem to stand guard over the valley, how the wind through the pines sounds almost like a lullaby. And if you listen very carefully on certain winter nights, when the snow is falling and the world is quiet, you might hear something else, an echo from the past, a woman's scream carried on the wind, the sound of hoofbeats in the snow, a story that refuses to be forgotten, because some stories are too important to let fade, some loves are too powerful to ever truly die, and some moments change everything, not just for the people who live them, but for everyone who comes after. That is the power of a single act of courage, of hearing someone in trouble and choosing to help instead of riding away, of looking into a stranger's eyes and seeing your future. Garrett Cooper rode into a blizzard to save Tessa Edwards, but in many ways, she saved him right back. She gave him the family he had always longed for. She gave him a reason to build instead of just survive. She gave him a home, not just in a physical place, but in her heart. And together, they created something that would echo through the decades, a love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the Wild West and the indomitable human spirit. It started with a scream in the darkness and a man brave enough to answer it. It grew into a lifetime of love and laughter and hard work. It became a family, a ranch, a legacy. And it all happened because one cowboy heard a cry for help and decided that no storm would stop him from doing what was right. That is the story of Garrett and Tessa Cooper. That is the foundation upon which everything else was built. And that is why, even now, more than a century later, their descendants still tell the story with pride. Still remember the night that changed everything. Still honor the courage and the love that made it all possible. Some people pass through this world and leave barely a ripple. Others create waves that touch shores they will never see. Garrett and Tessa were the latter. They lived good lives, built a good family, and left behind something that mattered. Not just property or money, but a story. A reminder that we are all capable of greatness in small moments. That heroism does not always look like what we expect. That sometimes it looks like a cowboy on a horse, riding through a blizzard toward the sound of someone who needs help. And that love, real love, the kind that lasts and grows and becomes the foundation for everything else, can start in the most unlikely ways, with a fall from a wagon, with a scream in the darkness, with a man who refused to ignore someone in trouble, with two hearts that recognized each other despite meeting in chaos and fear. That is the story. That is the legacy. And that is why the Cooper family ranch will always be more than just land and buildings. It is a testament to what is possible when courage meets circumstance, when love overcomes fear, and when two people decide that, together, they can weather any storm. from a blizzard to a lifetime, from strangers to soulmates, from a single moment of fate to generations of family. That is the power of choosing to care, of choosing to act, of choosing love even when everything seems impossible. Garrett and Tessa proved it. They lived it. And they left it behind for all of us to remember. Their story did not end when they died. It lives on in every person who carries their blood, in every acre of land that bears their name, in every retelling around a winter fire. It lives on as a reminder that we are all capable of extraordinary things, that we all have the potential to change someone's life. That love is worth fighting for, worth building on, worth passing down to the next generation. And it all started with one simple act. A cowboy heard a woman's screams and rode into the white to save her. Everything else, all the joy and love and family that came after, flowed from that single decision, to help, to care, to be brave when it would have been easier to turn away. That is the lesson. That is the truth at the heart of their story. And that is why it will never be forgotten.